I'm going to talk now specifically about second language learners. So what we have in our classrooms is a lot of the time is learners who've come from another country. So let's say we're in an English-speaking country and people are refugees or immigrants, and they have varied levels of English language competence and varied levels of competence in whatever language they was of the country that they came from. So how do we deal with that? Firstly, well, what are the differences? So there are differences in terms of the languages spoken at home. And some of those would be class differences, by the way, which is, are these poor people who've been refugees? Are these affluent business migrants who've come with a lot of money? What's their educational background in either case? So there's a whole lot of dimensions around socioeconomic dimensions, but also the levels of language spoken. So there's a whole pile of varieties, and also kinds of migrants as well. So these are all variables. It's not just a generic group. In fact, it's an incredibly internally differentiated group. There are also differences of age. So let's say somebody comes and they're midway through the elementary school or primary school, or they're into the high school. What's their level of competence in their first language? What have they learned of English? So in other words, because language and cognitive development track along beside them, and also this shift into academic literacies tracks along beside them, it's a totally different dynamic depending on what the age of the students is. And also there's this question of first language competence. So it may well be that the person's actual ability level in the first language is very variable. They might have done incredibly well at school. They might have had much schooling at all. So it's very, these are all the variables that have to be taken into account. What are the phases of development in moving into a second language, into a new language? So in addition to those issues of age, there are what Jim Cummins, the theorist of bilingual language development, describes as two major stages. One is basic interpersonal communicative skill. That's what he characterizes as the first level. And the second level is what he calls cognitive academic language proficiency. And in a way, this is sort of like the difference between orality and literacy, these multimodal literacies that we spoke about in the earlier videos, academic literacies. It's sort of like that difference. The only thing is that as, let's say, an elementary, primary or secondary student, that you mightn't have, moving into a new country, you mightn't have the basic interpersonal communicative skills. You've got to get those first. And then what's happened to your cognitive academic language proficiency, that's been disrupted because you've ended up in a school where you can't do language at that level, and you've got to catch up in language before you can even catch up with the others in terms of this cognitive academic language proficiency. So there's a unique set of dynamics and difficulties faced by young people coming into school, depending on the age and the level at which they come into school. A lot of complexity here. So to elaborate on that now, what we've built out is a kind of a three-step developmental phase, which is beginning in school, years 1 and 2 in the first couple of years. So as somebody, no matter what their age is, particularly as they come into the later parts of school, there are certain kinds of capacities which are developed. And then those capacities develop further towards academic language use in the new language. And ideally, in an ideal universe, in step 3, we keep both of those forms of cognitive and linguistic development moving on, and you become equally competent in these higher level academic literacies in both languages. What are our strategies around second language learners? And what I've done here is I've classified these strategies into two kinds of principle: the access principle and the diversity principle. So under the access principle, we might have separate English as a second language classes. Now remember, a lot of the time, this never happened. The kids were just thrown into the classroom, sink or swim, hope that you'll pick it up, do it, you're on your own. But in the next phase of development, what was set up were separate English language, second language teaching classes. And this is often still appropriate, by the way, if a student comes with absolutely no capacity in the language of the country to which they, or the language of the community into which they've moved. A second strategy is called classroom embedded ESL. So in other words, what we do is we have either a specialist coming in to support the student, or we have the teacher able to build specialist strategies so that although the student is embedded in the classroom, it might be a science classroom, it might be an English language arts classroom, that even though they're embedded in the classroom, the teacher has strategies, specific ESL strategies, in order to make sure that the child's time is meaningfully spent in their language development, and development in the subject areas grows. The third model is what's often called transitional bilingualism. So what we do is, let's say you're coming into a science class, you're a first language speaker of Spanish, the school is otherwise an English language school. Well, what we do is we have classes taught by bilingual Spanish teachers in science, and this is a transitional thing. So you don't miss out on your science because you are a Spanish language speaker. You've got someone who speaks both languages who can help you over, and it's just transitional. At a certain point, you can go into the English language classes and things are fine. So they're things that are according to the access principle. Now, the access principle shows a certain kind of openness in terms of compensatory education. We recognize that you're different, and we're going to do things to help you gain access. We're going to put a special effort into helping you to gain access to the school system and to society, which is a dominant English society. But there are also things we can do according to the diversity principle. And some of our language programs, you might fit under that category. For example, heritage language education. Now, we mightn't make it a serious part of the curriculum, but we might set up a community school which teaches Mandarin or teaches Greek after school, so the kids don't lose that language. So they keep that language, they can communicate with their parents, maybe even sometime in their life go and work in one of these contexts, or or just have a valuable thing to have this other language and not to lose it by virtue of migration, for instance. Sometimes these are on Saturday mornings, sometimes these are after school, but there's a whole tradition around what's called heritage language education. But in terms of the diversity principle also, there is also what's called dual language education or bilingual education. So if we're really, really serious about you keeping your Mandarin in a way that you can use not just around the kitchen table, but you can use for business deals, or if we're really keen for you to keep your Spanish not just so you can talk to your family, but so you can become a doctor who deals with patients in Spanish and understands the Spanish medical literature as well as the English language medical literature, we could make a dedicated effort to keep teaching English and science and a whole lot of subjects in both languages. So one of the classic models for doing this is you have a school, all the languages of instruction are half Chinese, half English, and that way you're continuing academic learning in both languages, and these things are absolutely parallel and they sit on an equal plane. So this is a kind of a range of strategies for dealing with second language learning and multilingual learning in bilingual, multilingual contexts.